I'm the first stop, like, after we're done.
How's your week done?
See you.
I know.
Been a while.
Yeah.
So if you get CRC, then hang up a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were able to see.
There you go.
No, I know this is. And then to have like the next one.
You're fine.
About when to check in, sometimes I'm late, sometimes
Love it.
every time we go through an exercise, what
If you don't have her sitting next to you, you know what?
I really do.
I'm not getting
That is not true at all. We're going to be here another day. You know? So.
Wow. So just like you said, you could call friends, family,
Yeah.
get a hotel, and
Yeah. And then the parts, like, if you're not on by this time, you're going to be out there. Perfect.
Is there anything folks have to discuss before we go on the record? We'll give it one more minute to let people arrive. Is anybody expecting anybody else?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
I'm Ray Albrecht with the National Biodiesel Board. I thought that Matt Coda was going to come from the
Okay.
Fuel Dealers Association. I would just say parking was especially hard to find.
Really?
Love to take mass transportation to get here, but
you don't have.
I do have the idea. I
got one of your
How are you? It's like,
I think there was a lot of cars being netted just by vehicles going around in circles.
That'd be fun.
Same crew of you met me.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun.
Are folks okay if we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, thank you.
So good afternoon. This is a workshop, you can case number 18-3810-INV, investigation into renewable energy standard rulemaking. My name is Elisa Schilling. I'm staff attorney here in Exeter with the commission. And with me today is Tom Nauer, who's the policy director for the commission. Just because I'm new and still learning names and faces, if folks could go around the room and just introduce themselves. We can start with folks at the table.
Leanne Margolis with the Department of Public Service. Kelly Laundrie, Department of Public Service.
Patty Richards, Washington Electric Co-op.
Sandra Levine, Conservation Law Foundation. Melissa Bailey, Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, and Burlington Electric Department.
Same, James. No, I'm not Melissa Bailey.
That's Melissa.
It's been a long day. James Gibbons, Burlington Electric Department, Vermont Public Power Supply Authority.
Matt Rutherford with Town of Stowe Electric Department. Graham Turk with Green Mountain Power.
Ray Albrecht, National Biodiesel Board.
I'm Kyle Landis-Marinello with the commission.
Amber Whitmere, NMR.
Phil Boyd, Encore Renewable Energy.
Dr. William, Vermont Electric.
Michael Lazorchak, Renewable Energy Vermont.
Nick Stoker, Skyview Ventures.
Melinda Humphrey, G&P.
Carolyn Anderson, Green Mountain Power.
Jeff Monder, Green Mountain Power. Bill Powell, Washington Co-op.
John Brabant, Vermonters for a Clean Environment.
Lisa Morris, Vermont Electric Co-op.
Keith Levinson from the department. Billy Coster at the Agency of Natural Resources.
Maria Fisher with the department.
Thank you. So the primary purpose of today's workshop is to discuss potential changes and improvements to the current processes and provisions for implementing the renewable energy standard, which is currently administered through 2 orders that were issued in 2016 in docket 8550. My hope for today is to keep things fairly high level by identifying some of the general issues that stakeholders have identified for improvements, as well as ideas for different proposals that stakeholders may have for making improvements. I'd also like to lay out some dates for next steps, as well as a general schedule for this pre-formal rulemaking process. So the only comments that we had issued or filed for today's workshop, we had some from the department. We also had some comments from William S. Scully, who I don't believe is here today. But maybe we could just start with going through the department's comments. Is the department prepared to kind of walk through the issues that you all identified?
Yeah, Ann Margolis with Department of Public Service. Give a little disclaimer to start with. We have said farewell to our lead attorney, as well as our at least tier 1 and 2 staff person on the renewable energy standard. So if we are either repetitive of points we've made before that folks have wanted to move on from, or we say something different from what we've said before, we're rebuilding our institutional knowledge base here, the res. So we filed some fairly high-level, short comments. I'll go through all tiers and tiers 1 and 2 and pass it over to my colleague Kelly for tier 3. So for all tiers, with respect to the compliance filings, it's our experience that it would be helpful to have a consistent template for our use when we're looking for the compliance filings to make our recommendations to the Commission. We are happy to provide a list of the fields that we think would be useful in that compliance filing. I think you probably don't want to get into that at this point.
We could just talk a little bit about it. So we have the banking spreadsheet, and so basically you're proposing to build off of the current renewable energy standard banking spreadsheet for purposes of showing compliance with all of the tiers.
Right, it could all be
in
put
one
into one larger
Yeah.
document. And as I understand it, a fair amount of effort was put into coming up with the banking template. And if we could just build upon that effort, that results in a clear product.
I think that makes sense. And I think it would be helpful to provide both the list of different metrics that you want to include in the spreadsheet, and then also an actual template, because sometimes in producing a template you realize things that you want to include that you might not if you're just putting it in a list format. So seeing both would be helpful. Obviously the list is most helpful for the rulemaking, but ensuring that we have everything, including the template, is helpful too.
And we don't want to suggest that we are the sole brains behind the template. We would love to work with the utilities and other stakeholders to maybe offline or whatever the commission would like to, however you'd like to see that process unfold before submitting.
Okay.
Looking back here, I'm Maria Fisher, who is one of our experts here on tiers 1 and 2. Should we move on?
Sure.
Okay. The other area that we wanted to just queue up for discussion either today or ideally at some future set of workshops would be accounting for external imports, particularly from Hydro-Quebec and New York Power Authority. In previous comments, I think we're hopeful that there would be some resolution with respect to some improvements in GIS to actually account for specific units, and also some sort of corresponding way for the New York GAT system to talk to the NEPL GIS system to record specific units. But despite some, I think, promising conversations in that regard and some sort of verbal commitments, at least on the part of the New York folks in New York, nothing concrete has materialized. I think the department would like to go off and do a little bit more work to see if we can, finally say that our efforts have come to naught that, or otherwise we can actually say something concrete and have some sort of documentation behind it. But we think that there's more room for clarity and eliminating any risk of double counting if we working with the utilities could go off and do some more work in that regard.
Were you able to look at the comments submitted by William Scully?
I did a quick overview,
Okay.
but I was on a call when
Okay,
I
so
couldn't
that's
digest them.
good.
But I think it reinforces the need to put a little bit more effort there.
The only response to, I took a very quick look at Mr. Scully's comments, and those were mostly focused on capacity, and
Okay.
here we're only talking about energy, so I think it might be a little bit, the comments talking past what the requirements are.
Okay.
But something that we would go look into.
I think that's it for tiers 1 and 2, and then all tiers. Passing on.
Dan, can I ask you a question? Did the department identify deficiencies in the last round in the process of how we reported? Were there problems with what happened last?
I'm going to actually maybe look to Maria, if you don't mind. I don't know that there were problems so much as maybe some lack of clarity, or a template would have made. Are you talking about the template?
The reporting for HQ.
Oh, for HQ and NIPA. I think there was maybe some inconsistencies in sort of the documentation that was provided utility to utility, and having that be more consistent would be helpful. Can I add anything?
Yeah, and I think ideally everybody it would benefit everybody if there just were recs associated with it, and when it showed up in your GIS account, if it didn't say system mix and instead.
I'm sorry, can you just keep your voice up?
Sorry. It would be helpful if recs actually showed up in the NEPL GIS rather than New York system mix attributes.
James Gibbons from Burlington Electric Department of Edison. The issue is that the New York system mix attributes that come through aren't necessarily attributable to NIPA. They could be any form of import, so you can't just look at those and say those are Vermont Tier 1. You need something to match against those imports. Now, granted, the DPS has the volumes of NIPA that all the utilities get, but it doesn't show up in the GIS as an unambiguous NIPA rec.
And just to follow up further on that, my understanding is New York GATS actually allows for unit specific, something that was not occurring back in 2015, 2016 when we first had the discussion. So because you can assign specific recs to specific units, in the department's mind it would be useful to actually have that, as Maria was saying. So we just want to work with the utilities. Just for clarity, the department is the contracting party with NIPA. So we'd be happy to work with the utilities and NIPA and New York GATS to try to sort this out.
Just to be clear, he's absolutely correct, which is that, but you could have a New York system mix came in that was related to simply a bilateral contract that was imported from New England. Without attaching those attributes, you guys cannot tell that New York system mix is attributable to NIPA. So
Yes.
that's my point.
Yes, thank you.
Tier 3?
Sure.
So our comments about the tier 3 component were on the same vein as the all tiers of having more consistency for comparability. So the first one is just about having some kind of consistent definition and practice for defining and calculating administrative costs, so we're now all talking about the same thing. And the same thing for our annual plans, having some kind of consistent summary table to be able to easily compare them to each other. There were some utilities that had really nice, like Vermont Electric had a nice summary table that made it really helpful to quickly see what was an overview of the plan. So we're happy to, again, kind of list out the list of things. I don't know, though, probably be good to have some discussion about how prescriptive the rules should be. It may just be that the rule says that the PUC should come up with a summary table, and this table's not actually put in the rule. I don't know we want to be changing rules every time you add or subtract a component, so that's something to think about, but we do think some consistency there would be helpful.
We can include some minimum provisions to make sure there's enough summary table. Okay.
I know in other rules, for example, the energy efficiency charge rule, there's language, using the form adopted by the department for this purpose.
Right. Yeah, something like that would be fine. And then the other part of our annual plan comment was about having the commission actually approve plans. During the workshop process for Tier 3, it was specifically suggested that the commission not approve plans, but the department is asking that be changed to specifically have the authority for the PUC to reject plans if they're not complete. We saw a lot of different components that were supposed to be included in the annual plans that weren't. Thought maybe having that approval process, I don't think the process itself would be different, but just having that clear authority to reject them if not complete would be helpful.
Follow up on Barton's proposals related to.
Yeah, certainly. I have no particular interest in an approval process around my Tier 3 plan this early in the Tier 3 process. I mean, we're trying to figure these things out. Any form of any kind of long approval process is going to be very, we're needing to figure out our programs, change them, redesign them. We've already seen a change in our EV program. You've got a 30-day comment window at this point where you can object to the programs, the plans, the changes. I think that's adequate in my opinion.
Washington Electric Co-op would support the comments made by Burlington Electric Department. There would be an added layer of delay potentially, and rather than run programs, we'd be caught up in reviewing plans, and I'm not sure the turnaround, how quick it would be for the PUC process to turn around approvals of annual plans.
On behalf of VEPSA and BED, I think I'd also just throw in that it adds complexity around changes to the annual plan, right? The current rule, the current PUC order calls for a 30-day notice to PUC and the department for changes to your annual plan, and I'm uncertain whether this would require then to get approval of changes, and that could certainly slow down implementation. And we're not entirely clear what this proposal gets us, what the problem we're trying to solve here, what the department's proposal is.
Yeah, again, we don't think there needs to be additional process. The process we've gone through is the same process we go through for the EEU approval plan, so it doesn't seem like the process needs to be lengthened. And we would just like to see some more clear authority about approval or rejection of plans. We don't think it needs to add to the process whatsoever. And there's the same kind of 30-day notice for changes to the EU annual plans as well. I don't think it would require any additional process there for changes.
Kelly, I have a clarifying question. Is the purpose of the PUC's approval to say you've met the minimum statutory requirements, or is it to say, we really like your plan?
I think the former than the latter.
Are you looking for something where the commission would be directing utilities to correct any deficiencies in the plan?
Correct, yes. I think that would make it clear that the PUC could do that.
This is Lisa Morris, Vermont Electric Co-op. We would just echo the concerns that have already been expressed by other utilities about potentially slowing things down. And just wondering, right now the way it works is we submit our plans and then we respond to comments, but we don't necessarily file amendments to a plan based on those comments. And if there were comments to the effect that something is missing from the plan, I know VEC would be happy to file an amended plan after the fact, and maybe that could be a midway point between what we're doing right now and a formal approval process from the commission.
I'm curious, do you think that the PUC couldn't make those kinds of comments absent your change?
I think it just makes it clear.
Can I just ask a question? Does the approval process the department is looking for, do you see an interplay between that and how spending or investments are treated in rate cases?
I'm not clear what you're
Does it affect whether something can be determined to be prudent or imprudent later on?
So, I'll get to that. I just want to back up a little bit. In response to Tom, what you had said, I think from the department's perspective, it would be really helpful to have the PUC saying, yes, this complies with the statutory requirements of this plan. That's one of the primary functions. With respect to your question, I think there's PUC precedent that's pretty clear about, you can have, for example, a certificate of public good for a generation project built by a utility. That does not mean it's automatically prudent. It makes it a little bit higher burden to challenge during a rate case. And I would expect that a clear PUC approval could at least go a decent way towards some similar precedent.
Good question for the department. If we get on the same page relative to a template for the annual plan, and we all knew exactly what the filing structure would be, could that help to avoid a PUC process of an extra layer of approval? We know what the boxes are to check and fill out. I think it makes it a whole lot simpler.
I mean, I think that's a piece of it, but we have a list now of things that are supposed to be, the components that are supposed to be in the annual plan, and there was definitely a number of deficits, so we have that list now, and it doesn't seem like it's necessarily being complied with. So I get us partway there.
Yeah, but maybe if we can agree on that template form, it's like, okay, here's the file, the boxes, like a specific template versus a list of things. Then it becomes more mechanical for us, and it's less likely we would be leaving things out, just a suggestion.
Well, sorry, James, I'm just responding to Patty's point. There's leaving things out, but it can also be, for example, a utility could make an assertion that we think this meets the statutory requirement of best practices for load management, and we disagree and we want the PUC to say, is the utility complying with the statute or not? So I understand your point of having something that's not just descriptive, but instead of a better filing format would mean that there's less discussion that would need to happen between the department and the utility, and more clarity as to whether or not we agree collectively whether the proposed plan meets the statutory obligations. But I don't think that necessarily addresses the final concern of if there's a dispute about whether we think the plan's requirements or the plan meets the statutory obligations, there should be resolution of that. And PUC is obviously the only one who can do it.
So question for the DPS. The deficiencies and things that you're describing, are those what you communicated today? Or was there another communication on deficiencies with Tier 3 plans? There were a set of comments today on the Tier 3 plans. Are those the...
Yes, the comments on the Tier 3 plans that the department filed.
Today.
That brought it. Oh, yes, they were due today. Sorry. Yeah.
So those are the list of deficiencies, and so that you're...
I think there's some of them. They might not be fully comprehensive, but there was a number of them there, yes.
So I guess that emphasizes my concern, which is 40 days after the filing of the Tier 3 plan, we're hearing the concerns for the first time. It's not setting itself up for a really fast process.
Well, I guess I'll qualify, given your comment, what I said. We didn't include some of the deficiencies that were already brought up at the RES annual plan workshop. So we didn't repeat things that had already been asked at the workshop.
And I would also say, James, that I would think the process would potentially change as well to be more streamlined. I'm not sure that the workshop process is necessarily the best way if we're looking for approval. That written filings might actually be more appropriate and sufficient time for the department to work with utilities and try to sort stuff out, ensuring that there's still a transparent process and everything else. I'm just saying, I understand your concern about timing, but that can be addressed in the process.
I just have another question about the parallel with the EU annual plans and modifications. Specifically, I'm concerned about making changes to the annual plans during the year. If EU changes to their plans require PUC approval, I think there's some latitude for the efficiency utilities to make changes to their programs
it wouldn't trigger the need for affirmative PUC approval?
They do not need approval for a number of the changes, and there's triggers. Dave Westman might be able to speak more specifically to those triggers, and I think it's the same type of thing, though, that if there is no comment, then they go forward for the ones that they ask for, or notify changes about.
And would you envision the same kind of structure here?
Yeah.
Well, another possibility too is, for example, if the petitioner files a CPG under 248, there's process for changing that petition midstream. It's spelled out in the rule, what's the substantive change, what's not. You could do something in terms of if you propose changes in the dollar amounts versus brand new programs, things like that. So again, this is something that we're not saying like, here's a solution, everything's nice and easy. We're saying that we think additional process would be required and approval process would be helpful, and recognize that some things we need to change along with that, and greater clarification would be useful from the department working with stakeholders.
Follow-up comments or questions, or should we move on? So that, I think we've now gone over 3 substantive areas that the department raised comments about. You could hear from other stakeholders if folks have general topic areas that they'd like to see changes in renewable energy standards.
So are you opening up the floor then?
If folks are ready to,
Again, my name is Ray Albrecht, National Biodiversity Board. I've been coming to these meetings for a number of years since the early days of the program. And Matt Coda is here. I think most of you know him from the Fuel Dealers Association. We had participated in the original legislative effort, however many years back that was. And at that time, it seemed like the intent of the legislature was to have a balanced program that was technology neutral, let all players get out onto the playing field, and specifically in regard to Tier 3 for energy transformation projects, okay, which is a broadly defined program, which from a national perspective, and I get involved with renewable portfolio standard programs in many, many states, and the Tier 3 program here really is very innovative, and I think is a model for the rest of the country. But it seems that since the implementation of the Tier 3 program, that there's been very limited, if any, real interest by the DUs in implementing non-electric type projects. Okay, and here in Vermont you have a lot of homegrown resources, not just solid biomass, but also biodiesel, which we have discussed on a number of occasions, because there's already quite a business activity going on to collect used cooking oil, and folks have also talked about growing feedstock here. So, but the point that we'd like the public service folks to focus on during the process is how do we increase the level of participation by these technologies that are probably foreign to the electric utilities, okay, or maybe do not directly serve their business interests. I looked at the original legislation, which I've got right here on my computer, and it says that distribution utilities, when they're supposed to look at the economic, energy, whatever benefits of the measures that they're proposing, but if those measures increase the use of electricity, that they are specifically required to look at alternate measures that are non-electrification measures. In other words, if the utility wants to look at EVs and heat pumps and whatever, that at the same time in that analysis, they're supposed to look at the non-electric measures. That's in the statute, okay? And it does not seem that that has happened. That's a circuit breaker mechanism, you know, to keep a lid on the cost of the program. And I think is a way of fulfilling the original intent for this to be a broad-based program for all Vermonters. So I guess, you know, I would hope that you folks could, address that in greater detail. Matt, would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, Matt Coda with the FDA on behalf of the companies, unregulated companies that provide fuel and heating services, some of which are renewable. We've had lovely conversations with utilities regarding ways that we can collaborate, but there hasn't been a deal. So the question that I often get asked by those that sell renewable energy and sell services that reduce fossil fuel consumption in line with Tier 3 goals is how can we be part of this process? And if the answer is nothing, the utilities get to decide, and if they want to not include us, then that's their right. I'd like to hear that. Right now we've had very nice conversations, but we don't have a method of which to petition a certain renewable energy product or service that reduces fossil fuels before the PUC, other than having coffee with the utilities. We'd like to get in on that.
James Gibbons, Burlington Electric. So it sounds like you were unaware that we ran a reverse RFP with an open solicitation for anybody wanting to propose Tier 3 measures. Did you know about that?
I did not know about that.
Okay, so apparently the press releases and everything we've done on that did not work, but we got no responses from anybody, period. We had an open RFP for any measures to meet Tier 3. We would consider anything proposed on essentially a cost bid basis, and we got 0 replies. We were attempting to reissue that RFP, but I'm kind of surprised that if you say you've been as engaged in this as you have, that you were completely unaware that we proposed the reverse RFP on our last Tier 3 plan and ran it this year.
Yeah, completely unaware.
Yeah.
I'll give you my business card.
Yeah. Can you disclose your mailing list that you used?
It was public. We did a press release in the Free Press. I mean, we tried to make it as it was open to everybody.
Sure.
We didn't use an internal mailing list of people. We were literally trying to solicit any measure or program. We considered programs as well if presented as a program from any source to meet Tier 3, and we got no replies. So.
Well, to be fair to BED, we've had meetings in your office discussing ways of collaboration.
Yeah.
They haven't materialized in advance.
Well, it materialized in the reverse RFP, which no one replied to. So.
Okay. New York State Public Service Commission generally, when there are informal types of activities going on that would benefit from greater dissemination, they open up dockets, okay, formal matters, okay, and then those can be conduits for disseminating information, okay, that will help the broader process. So that might be something that you could do here. So.
Just a follow-up question too. So there is a process for prior approval of the energy transformation projects, and one of the provisions allows that if the DU is not immediately sponsoring a project, the project can approach the department. So it says for potential energy transformation projects that are not immediately sponsored and tagged by a DU, a project component. Oh, immediately. Sorry. For those potential energy transformation projects that are not immediately sponsored in the tag TAG by a DU, a project component may present its project to the department for an initial review. If the department concludes that the project can be viable as an energy transformation project, the department may share its review and conclusions with the DUs who may determine whether to pursue full evaluation of the project through the tag. So I was just wondering if you all have had any discussions with the department about any particular projects through that process.
Yeah, although I think the language that you have read related back to, the spreadsheet that VEIC put together, and this was, a couple of years back now, with all the measures, and this language, I think, was applicable to folks who had technologies that they were trying to get on the spreadsheet, so to speak. In other words, have them be technically evaluated. I think the issue that we're looking here is then, okay, so there's a list of measures on the ZEIC spreadsheet, which includes heat pumps and biodiesel, solid biomass, pellet boilers. We went through quite, the usual list of suspects, okay? So the question here then is implementation by the utility. So I think your statement is well taken, that you made an effort, okay? For some reason we just did not connect. So I guess the other half of that question would be then Green Mountain Power. Maybe Matt can speak to that in terms of discussions that have taken place.
Just to clarify, there are several biofuel projects that have been, or measures that have been characterized through the TAG process. So
yeah,
they are available. To my knowledge, it's been minimal uptake, if any.
Right.
We've had, Matt Code again, back to the FDA, we've had several conversations with Green Mountain Power. They're very much interested in, what we might be able to collaborate on. It's just getting to that, over that hurdle, and I don't know how that happens outside of a PUC meeting or outside of a formal. If that happens through an RFP process, if that's what the best scenario is, the only scenario we have, then that's the one we'll have to take. But right now, they're just discussions. They're helpful discussions. They're promising discussions, but for an unregulated seller of renewable fuel, it's unclear how to now get into the tier 3 market without essentially developing a collaboration. If it's through answering an RFP and being accepted by the utility, okay, but does the PUC or the department have any say in whether or not they accept that RFP? I think the answer is no.
I think the answer is no as well, but James Gibbons from DD. The only other thing I would offer for the Commission's consideration too is that staffing is finite. We can only run, this is year one of the program, we can only spool up so many programs so fast. The RFP was our particular attempt to try to find out what programs we're going to be missing that might be practically spool up. That doesn't mean that every single thing that was brought forward to us was going to get spooled up at the same time. We literally had a certain number of bodies, but we wanted to see if there was something that was particularly economic or beneficial or high impact that we were unaware of. And obviously in any case there would be something like that, we'd share that information with anybody who asked for it. As a general rule, right? Not, again, confidential responses aside. If we thought there was a type of measure that we'd seen in RFP, we would share that with the other utilities as a matter of course.
Follow-up questions or comments on the issues we've been discussing? Do others have general comments like today or issues to be raised? I guess we could move to talking about schedule for follow-up comments and future workshops. So the department proposed a high-level schedule of having a draft rule by April 1st of 2019, and then some additional workshops, so a workshop in January, and then maybe again in late February or early March, and then workshops following an April 1st draft rule issuance. I think it would also be helpful to set a date for folks to file follow-up comments to what was discussed today, and for the department to provide further elaboration on some of the things that you all suggested. Would Friday, January 18th be a workable date for follow-up comments to today's workshop?
Sure, what was the date?
Friday, January 18th. So a little more than a month. It's the holidays, and so people are coming out.
Would it help for us to share the RFI? I just am curious if people would be interested in seeing. I mean, I did just pull it up real quickly, and the headline is Burlington Electric issues RFI for new programs in projects to help reduce or eliminate fossil fuel consumption, launches new web tool for use by customer businesses, nonprofits, and community to participate in DED's Tier 3 electrification initiatives. I mean, like I say, we were trying to be proactive, you know, so.
Sure, if you'd like to file that.
Yeah, you can file that
the
as
case
well.
number.
And there was a tool where you could enter things into, and there was an RFP document as well, or RFI document as well.
You could share that, that would be great. So, Friday, January 18th? Okay. So we'll set that as a date for folks to file follow-up comments and proposals to today's workshop. So should we go through in more detail or what you all are filing, or do you feel like you have a sense of
What you would like from us?
Yeah, what, yeah.
As much clarity as you'd like to provide to us, that would be helpful.
Okay, so I can outline that in a follow-up memo
Thank you.
issued after this workshop. And then for the next workshop, which will be following up to those comments on Friday, January 18th, I'm thinking it's good enough thing the last week of January or first week of February. I don't know if we need to set that date in this meeting today, but I can look at schedules and include the date for that in the memo that I'll issue after this workshop. And I think the department's proposal of having a draft rule by Monday, April 1st, I think
April
that's...
Fool's Day?
What?
April Fool's Day? Everyone thinks that's ironic.
We could do Tuesday, April 2nd.
Personally, I'm happier with that.
I mean, maybe we may be able to issue something before that, but I think that's a good goal to get a draft rule out there. So we'll be aiming for that.
Just one, if there's any way possible to avoid February 1st for a workshop date, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have avoid dates. Those are actually very helpful.
January 31 is that.
Okay.
Great to avoid.
Thanks, Ed. Do you have anything?
Sure. So we've heard some of the department's proposals on ways that we can improve things, and we've heard from the fuel dealers and the biodiesel board. We've accomplished, we've gone through the substance of this meeting in about 42 minutes, and that's astounding to me. So I'm taking from that we have crafted a well-oiled machine, and everyone who has been silent is happy with the way things are going. So if you have concerns, you can raise them now, but be sure to express them to us at some point.
And we could go through the order section by section, if that would be helpful, or if that's too detailed for today, that's something we could do at a later workshop when we dive into certain issues in more detail. So if any thoughts about that? And
So I think one of the issues that I think is going to be difficult is what's appropriately in a rule that once it's in a rule takes a minimum of 9 months to actually change. And that's why we talked about the idea of some forms, other things that wouldn't be codified in the rule. As James had mentioned earlier, we're still in the early stages of Tier 3. We want to have the general principles enshrined in there, but we also don't want to limit flexibility, creativity going forward. So I think the concern I have getting into this workshop and this whole process is sort of what's in a rule. Do you just take the major aspects of what was in the order, plunk them down in there, and how do you signal what aspects need flexibility, what should be codified? In some ways you could just take portions of your order and just plunk it directly into a rule and be done with the entire process. We're recommending things that we think would be helpful for the overall process. Some of these, though, we're not recommending that they be in rule necessarily. So that, I think, is a question. I guess I'm turning this into a question for the PUC. What kind of, are you looking for guidance of what you want in the rule? Or are you looking for process overall about how res implementation is going?
I think both. You know, in your comments about compliance filings, for example, you said you could provide a list of additional data for evaluating compliance as well as a template. And while I don't think that the banking spreadsheet or the template needs to be a part of the rule, we could incorporate components of the list of what needs to be in the spreadsheet into the rule, right? So we could also make it a non-exhaustive list in case there are things that need to be added in the future. So I think including those additional pieces that we want to include in the rule and being clear on maybe what additional specificity we need in the rule, while also providing some of the guidance type things like the spreadsheet is helpful. It's helpful to do those things simultaneously because then you make sure that the things for actual compliance are accurately reflected in the rule language. So when folks are filing things, you can clarify, we think this needs to be stated more clearly in rule language, or we think that this needs to be a part of guidance, or we just think that this will help the process generally. So.
Some comments that I have suggested to Matt Cota, which I would surface here, is that along the lines of the solicitation that BED had issued, I think it would be helpful if the distribution utilities did have open solicitations so that everybody can compete, okay, no matter what technology they might bring to the table, and for the responses to that solicitation to be rank ordered and based upon the cost per, dollars and cents per megawatt hour of savings achieved, okay? And I think there should be limitations placed upon the distribution utilities in terms of their privilege or ability to cherry pick from that list. In other words, it really should not be a way of developing a list of the cheapest electrification measures. I think they should be encouraged or told, by you folks to be technology neutral. Okay. The second thing is that the electric utilities may want to provide their own additional incentives for certain measures above and beyond the dollars that we're talking about in terms of the credits. If that does take place, then the fundamental issue that many other states have had to address is the utility funding that might be supplementing projects. Is that coming out of the rate base, ratepayer funds, or are those dollars coming out of shareholder funds? And is that differentiation being done properly? Okay, because in New York, I think everybody knows there's a lot of abuse of the use of ratepayer funds to support activities that should in fact be supported through shareholder funds. So that's, starts to get a little bit complicated, but I think the idea of open solicitations where, the bids are publicly, announced and disseminated, I think would be helpful.
So to follow up on that point, Burlington Electric is going to be potentially technologically agnostic, but not cost insensitive. I mean, we have least cost planning obligations, we have rate obligations. So the odds that I'm going to issue an RFP and then lottery award is pretty slim. There's going to be a cost component, and there's a cost component in the RFP we issue. Right. So that's my response. Is that, you made some reference to, without reference to cost, and we have an ACP penalty. We're the ones exposed to the obligation under the statute. But however, we also have an obligation to meet our obligations in the least cost manner possible.
Right. So and I think the renewable fuel people are just looking for the opportunity to compete.
My reaction was specifically to something you said about without cherry picking the cheapest cost thing. And I think at some point we are obligated to look for the less expensive way to comply with an obligation.
Yeah, but I was specifically referring to if you had biomass electric, and so forth down the list, or were you going to, can a utility simply select the cheapest electrification measures on the list, or ought you to select the cheapest measures regardless of technology? And that's where I think some trust building, okay, with verification would be appropriate.
This undermines my own point, but I feel I'm obligated to put it out there. But much like we had an issue with Efficiency Vermont, that was correctly wrong, and the utilities with regards to credit for heat pumps, we may be in a similar situation with wood pellet boilers, given that there's a generous rebate from Efficiency Vermont for pellet boilers. If we were to enter into an agreement with a utility for fossil fuel savings per boiler, wood pellet boiler installed, would we be up against the same sort of dynamic that we had? Please tell me I'm wrong.
No, Matt, you're right, and it's even more complicated because we're required to offer that incentive by statute.
Yeah, so we've got that, and we've got, of course, high efficiency equipment that we can demonstrate quite clearly reduces fossil fuel consumption. But if there's an incentive for that from Efficiency Vermont, then we can't claim it. But if there's not, we can. There's lots of things to be sorted out, which frankly, the average heating service provider, heating fuel company, it's a lot of steps. It's a lot of steps. But we think we have something to offer, and that's why we're here today.
I just wanted to add one comment for the record because we are being, it's going to be a transcript for the record. There's only one utility in the state that has shareholders. All the other utilities, the shareholders and the ratepayer are the same.
Yeah.
So there's no risk that a co-op can transfer to somebody else. The risk is going to be borne directly by the ratepayer. And certainly every utility is looking at it from a rate base perspective. Washington Co-op has rate increase pressure. So we're going to be looking for the cheapest programs we can offer that's the best bang for the buck for the membership and what we think our members, what direction that they want to take. So just for the record, from a co-op standpoint, our shareholders they are the rate base and they are the members of the co-op. One and the same.
Yeah.
Can't transfer that risk to
I can
anybody
see
else.
that happening here in Vermont, in New York State, referring back to the New York Power Authority, which is so heavily steeped in politics in terms of their rate making and how they divvy up their cheap power. I would not expect them to show the same type of behavior that the smaller entities here would, and I deal with that all the time. So that's why I come in a little bit jaded in terms of what's driving people's decision making. And if it's an investor-owned utility, that's, I think, fairly easy to understand that there are competing interests, okay, multiple driving forces for the decision making. For the smaller, muni type of organizations, which we do have some in New York, and then they're scattered across New England. Yeah, the decision making is often more homespun and more genuine.
This is Jeff Monder from Green Mountain Power. I would observe that there's a component of the calculation of Tier 3 megawatt hours that creates a challenge for measures that offset fossil fuel without applying electrification, and that is the use of the heat rate in the calculation, because regardless, and this impacts not just biofuels, but also weatherization measures, which we've had the conversation about in the past as potentially being valuable as an added incentive to cold climate heat pumps. But what the heat rate does is it uses the grid-based heat rate and creates kind of an assumption of 30% efficiency. And that discount of 30% efficiency gets applied to measures even if there's no involvement of electrification in the measure. So what it does is it reduces the, it increases the cost per megawatt hour for those types of projects. And it does represent a complication because you just can't come up with enough value to offset the cost of projects, particularly for weatherization projects, simply because of that discount.
So that's in statute right now.
And is in statute, yeah.
So, well, I appreciate you raising that today in this rulemaking proceeding. I guess this is something that would need to be raised before the legislature for us to make any changes in this rulemaking proceeding.
So I actually agree with Jeff's concern, recognizing it's in statute, uses national data rather than New England data, so sort of skewed already. But, and sorry I should know this, but isn't there also the PUC supposed to do a general review of Tier 3 or something for the legislature? Is that correct? Or is it just that there's some discussion in 8550 of doing a review?
2020.
Yeah.
2020.
And is that, sorry, in the docket or the statute?
It's in the docket.
Okay.
So there was a discussion in the 8550 docket of doing a 2020 review. Actually, Tom and I were talking earlier today. To the extent we can do as much of that review in this rulemaking proceeding, we think that makes sense. It would certainly be a shame to go through the whole rulemaking process and then in a year or less than a year decide we need to totally redo the rule. So, yes, to the extent people have things that they think might be appropriate for a 2020 review, please raise those things in your comments that you include with your rulemaking comments.
And so from the department's perspective, I think it would be useful to identify even statutory changes, recognizing PUC alone can't do something like that, but to the extent that there can be consensus around issues such as that, that can be presented to the legislature, potentially with the PUC.
That sounds good. So if there are any statutory changes, please include those in your comments that are submitted by Friday, January 8th.
Melinda Humphrey, Green Mountain Power. We have as we're headed into year 2 of this, we have some comments about a few things that are on our radar that we haven't had a chance to experience yet. The first being that the banking into year 2. So as we head into our report for vintage 2018 RECs, we have some RECs from year 1 that we have banked and we will be using in vintage 18, which is year 2. And then we'll have some newly banked RECs in year 2 that will be then carrying forward. And so I'm anxiously waiting to see what that process what it'll look like when we get a chance to report that, and if it might become a little bit unwieldy, or if the current spreadsheet is still going to be able to hold up as we move into that. And I don't know if the other DUs are going to be in the same position as us or not. The other piece is that the Tier 3 plan is due significantly earlier than the end of the vintage delivery year for 2018. One is in February or March and the other is in August. And so for a utility that's planning to use excess Tier 2 RECs for the Tier 3 requirement, that plan is due before those Tier 2 RECs are fully minted or tangible to use. And so while I know it's just a plan, it's still kind of trying to get our head wrapped around if that'll cause some difficulty or not to implement.
Thinking about your comment about the banking spreadsheet, does the department may be filing a template for all compliance filings, and at that point, GMP and the other utilities will be able to review that, and if you think that there would be issues with us becoming unwieldy, or if you have better ideas for how to structure the spreadsheet, that would be the opportunity to provide that comment.
Tucker Williams, VEC. Just following up on Melinda's comment on the Tier 2 rec banking, there's a little bit of unclarity surrounding whether or not recs from the current year can be banked. So for 2018, for example, if we could have met our requirement fully with 2018 recs as is, and using 2017 banked recs, and then banking the extra 2018 recs that would have otherwise been used. It'd be great to get some clarity around what that actual process looks like, so that we don't bank more than we should, and especially lose them, effectively if we can't use them at a later year. But that wasn't clear. So if
Sorry.
yeah, let me start that over. So if you have recs banked from the previous year, and then you have more than enough recs from the current year to meet your obligation, but you want to use what's already banked and then bank the excess, can that be done? I guess would be good to get a clear understanding of.
So the current statute and order allow for the recs to be banked for 3 years. So presumably you could use the banked recs, bank the rec from the current year, and then use those within the next 3-year period.
So to try to paraphrase the question, I think I got it. There's no prescribed FIFO, LIFO. It expires and needs to be used before it expires, and as long as that condition hasn't been met, you can use it. That's how I would interpret it.
Agreed.
Just to follow up to Tucker, I think that was some of our concern as well, in terms of being able to follow it on paper was my concern, and I think a best practice would obviously be to use the oldest first, so that they're rolling off in 3 years rather than worrying about which
Okay.
having 2018s and using all 2018 and 2018 and then moving the 2017s to year 3.
Yeah.
It's just you've got to roll off all the stuff that you banked first before you can use some of your new stuff, which keeps pushing stuff down the road. But and that was my concern of confusion down the road.
So you're suggesting maybe a clarification in the rules, that would be the process of using the oldest first, something like that?
Perhaps, yeah, and I don't know what it looks like yet, but something in the template may be helpful for that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know if I would, personally, I just would suggest that I don't necessarily think that's necessary. It's really prudent utility practice to use things that will expire first and hold things later, and I don't really know that you need to prescribe that treatment personally. I mean, I'm certainly going to be, unless someone tells me otherwise, I will be using my 2018 recs before my 2019 recs.
I think that is clear to me. I just want to make sure that we can use banked recs when we already have enough recs to fully meet our current year. It wasn't clear to me that was the case or was not. So that was what I was looking for, clarification.
If there's any specific language that is in the order right now that's causing that confusion for you, if you could highlight that in a follow-up comment.
Sure.
Does anyone else have issues they'd like to raise before we adjourn today? And we're going to have more workshops, so more opportunity to provide comments, and once we have language, it'll also make things easier to provide specific comments.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you all for participating. So if there's nothing further, we're adjourned.